Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that's going to feel like opening your grandmother's jewelry box and finding receipts instead of pearls. You know, Laura Ingalls Wilder, the sunbonnet, the prairie dress, the little girl who turned hardship into triumph, poverty into poetry, and the entire American frontier into a bedtime story your teacher read you in 3rd grade. But here's what they didn't tell you in that classroom. Laura lied. Not the way a con artist lies, not the way a politician lies, but the way a woman who survived decades of failure and watched her father chase dreams off cliffs lies, the way someone who needs to eat lies, the way a 65-year-old woman sitting on a Missouri farm during the Great Depression, staring at a blank page and thinking about how to pay next month's mortgage, lies. She lied to survive, and her lies became the truth that millions of Americans believe about their own history. Tonight, you're going to meet the real towns, the real family, the real mud, the real hunger, the real grasshoppers that ate leather and fence posts. You're going to stand in a depression in the ground near Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and realize that's all that's left of the Dugout home, where a 7-year-old girl lived half buried in a creek bank, watching her father's wheat die for the 3rd year in a row. And you're going to ask yourself the question historians have been asking for decades. When does a beautiful lie become more powerful than an ugly truth? Because here's the thing about Laura Ingalls Wilder. She didn't just write books. She wrote American identity. She told a generation of Depression-era readers that their grandparents had conquered the West with grit and goodness. That hard work always pays off. That family is enough. That pioneers were heroes. And none of it was quite true. Let me paint you the picture you think you know. You've seen it 1,000 times. The covered wagon rolling across golden prairie, Pa with his fiddle, making everything okay, Ma keeping a clean house with a dirt floor and a smile, Mary and Laura in matching dresses, learning lessons about kindness and perseverance. The books told you that the Ingalls family moved west to claim free land under the Homestead Act, that they built a life with their own hands, that when grasshoppers destroyed their crops they endured, that when winter came, they survived, that pioneers like them built America. And your teachers nodded. Your parents bought you the books. The TV show aired for 9 seasons. The story became canon. Except Charles Ingalls didn't homestead that land in Minnesota. He filed a preemption claim which meant he had to buy it, and he borrowed money to do it. Money he couldn't pay back when the crops failed. 3 times. Except the family didn't endure the hard times with quiet dignity. They ran. From Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa and back to Minnesota and finally to South Dakota. 5 states in 15 years. Every time Charles promised it would be different. Every time it wasn't. Except the land wasn't empty. The Osage people had been promised the Kansas land. The government had signed treaties. And then white settlers like Charles Ingalls moved onto it anyway, built houses, ploughed fields, and acted shocked when the government enforced the law and made them leave. Except Laura's baby brother Freddie died at 9 months old, probably somewhere near South Troy, Minnesota, and Laura never mentioned him in the published books. Never. Because dead babies don't fit the narrative, except the books weren't even really Laura's. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, a successful writer in her own right, rewrote them, changed scenes, invented dialogue, restructured entire chapters, and then they fought for years about who the real author was. Except. And yet, the books are beautiful. They're genuinely beautiful. I've read them. You've probably read them. They have a warmth and a rhythm that feels true even when the facts aren't. That's the power of what Laura did. She took a childhood defined by poverty, displacement, crop failure, infant death, and her father's repeated financial disasters, and she turned it into something children could read before bed. Something that made them feel safe. Something that taught them that bad things happen, but families endure. And she did it by leaving out everything that hurt too much to say. Here's what tonight is really about. We're going to walk through the actual places. The real Walnut Grove. The real Plum Creek, the dugout site you can still visit today, maintained by the Gordon family who bought the farm in 1947 and realised they'd purchased a piece of American mythology. We're going to read the land records, the census data, the newspaper accounts of the grasshopper plagues that destroyed 500,000 acres of Minnesota crops between 1874 and 1876. We're going to look at the final proof papers Charles Ingalls filed on July 7th, 1876, when he sold his land claim to the US government for $413 and immediately resold it to Abraham Keller for $400. $13 profit after 2 years of work and 3 crop failures. $13 to show for building a house, ploughing virgin prairie, planting wheat, and watching insects eat everything 3 summers in a row. That's the math of the American frontier that Laura didn't write about. And we're going to meet the real people, not the characters in the books, but the actual Charles and Caroline Ingalls, whose marriage somehow survived 15 years of constant moving and economic disaster. The actual Mary, who lost her sight in 1879, probably from viral meningoencephalitis. Not scarlet fever like the books claim. The actual Laura, who at age 7 watched grasshoppers descend like a dark snowstorm and eat not just the wheat, but the curtains, the leather harnesses, even the wooden tool handles. She remembered all of it, every detail, and 60 years later she made choices about what to keep and what to cut. Tonight, we're examining those choices. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books are probably the most influential history education millions of Americans ever received. Elementary school teachers still assign them. Libraries still stock them. Parents still read them to their kids at bedtime. And they're fiction. Autobiographical fiction, yes. Based on real events, yes. But fiction nonetheless. Laura herself said it. All I have told is true. Sagt, but it is not the whole truth. She said that in 1937 at the Detroit Book Fair. Just casually admitted that she left things out, and nobody pushed her on it because nobody wanted to know what got left out. But we know now. In 2014, the South Dakota Historical Society Press published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography. That's Laura's original manuscript, written in pencil on school tablets around 1929 and 1930 before Rose rewrote it for children, and it's different. The adult manuscript includes poverty, real, grinding poverty. It includes violence. It includes racism, casual and explicit. It includes her father's failures, clearly and repeatedly. It includes the fear, the hunger, the times when Pa came home with nothing and Ma had to figure out how to feed 4 daughters on credit and hope. The publishers who saw that manuscript in the early 1930s rejected it. Too dark, too depressing. Nobody wanted to read about the frontier like that. So Rose and Laura changed it. They made it gentle. They made Pa a hero instead of a dreamer who couldn't hold on to land. They made the moves sound like adventures instead of economic failures. They took the hunger and called it character building. And it worked. The books became beloved. They sold steadily through the Depression, through World War II, through the post-war boom. By the 1970s, when the TV show aired, they were American mythology. And mythology is more powerful than history, because mythology tells you who you wish you were. Here's the specific place we're talking about tonight. Section 5, Township 111 North, Range 36 West, Redwood County, Minnesota. About 1.5 miles north of the town of Walnut Grove on what's now County Road 5. If you visit today, you'll see a working farm. The Gordon family still owns it. You can pay a small fee and walk down to Plum Creek. There's a depression in the south-facing bank, about 12 feet by 12 feet. That's where the dugout was. That's where Laura, age 7, lived in a house carved into dirt, where the walls were sod blocks cut from prairie grass, where the roof was cottonwood poles covered with more sod, and after the first rain, the grass sprouted and grew on top of the house, where there was maybe one window, if the family could afford glass, where mice and beetles came in from the surrounding earth, because how do you seal a house made of dirt? The books describe the dugout as cozy, as an adventure. In reality, it was poverty. Dugouts were what you lived in when you couldn't afford lumber, when you arrived on the prairie with nothing and had to shelter your family immediately. They were temporary. Pioneers built them, knowing they'd replace them with real houses as soon as they could. Charles Ingalls did build a real house. According to his final proof papers filed in June 1876, he had constructed a dwelling 20 feet by 24 feet, 10 feet high, with 5 doors and 3 windows. But here's the problem with those papers. They claim he'd been living in that house since June 26, 1874. But the family settled the land in late May 1874. That means Charles allegedly built a sawn lumber frame house with 5 doors and 3 windows in less than 4 weeks. Anyone who knows construction knows that's nearly impossible. Especially when you're also ploughing virgin prairie, planting wheat, and trying to feed a family. So either Charles lied on his land claim papers, which was common, or the family lived in the frame house much less time than Laura's books suggest, or the dugout phase was shorter than she remembered, or. This is what happens when you try to match literary memory to legal documents. The gaps appear, the contradictions pile up, and you realise that the story you know is someone's version, shaped by time and need, and the pressure to make suffering mean something. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this story. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 7 years old when she lived in that dugout. 7. That's 2nd grade. The age when memories are forming but also highly unreliable. The age when children believe what their parents tell them about why things happen. And Pa would have told her this was an adventure, that they were pioneers, that next year would be better, that the land was theirs for the taking. So when Laura sat down 60 years later to write about it, was she remembering reality? Or was she remembering the story Pa told her to make a 7-year-old feel safe? We can't know. What we do know is that the books she created resonated so deeply that they changed how America remembered its own past. They became the story of westward expansion for millions of people, and that means, if we want to understand American historical consciousness, if we want to know why certain myths persist, we have to understand Laura Ingalls Wilder, not the character, the woman. Tonight, you're going to meet her. The real her. The girl who survived a childhood of constant displacement. The woman who married a man as unlucky as her father. The widow who finally found success at age 65 by selling a version of her life that left out everything too painful to speak. You're going to meet her family. Charles, whose restlessness doomed them to perpetual motion. Caroline, whose silence in the books is deafening, because what could she say? That she begged him to stop moving, that she wanted to stay in Walnut Grove where they had friends and a church and a life. You're going to meet the land. Not the golden prairie of television, but the real Minnesota prairie that kills wheat when the rain doesn't come and breeds clouds of insects that eat everything when it does. And you're going to meet the myth, the beautiful, terrible myth that Laura and Rose created together, that TV producers amplified, that teachers perpetuated, and that historians are now finally carefully dismantling. Because here's what this story is really about. It's about who gets to tell the past, who gets to decide what matters and what gets forgotten. It's about the difference between history and memory, between what happened and what we say happened. It's about the fact that sometimes a lie wrapped in beauty can teach truth better than raw facts. And it's about standing in a depression in the ground on a farm in Minnesota and realizing that this place, this tiny specific place, became the setting for one of the most powerful American stories ever told, a story that wasn't quite true, but maybe that was never the point. Laura Ingalls Wilder spent her entire childhood being lied to by geography, by weather, by her father's promises, by the Homestead Act's guarantee that 160 acres was enough to make a life, by the idea that hard work automatically led to success. So when she finally had a chance to tell her story, maybe she decided that if the world had lied to her, she'd lie back. She'd make it beautiful. She'd make it meaningful. She'd make it into something that could be loved. And we loved it. God, did we love it. We loved it so much that we forgot to ask what she left out. Tonight we're asking, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's walk into the gap between the myth and the Minnesota mud. Because the truth is messy, but it's also real. And real is what Laura actually lived through, before she turned it into something beautiful enough to sell. Let me show you what that looked like. You're standing on the edge of everything you've ever known, and your father is smiling. That's the image I want you to hold. Charles Ingalls, May 1874, 38 years old, standing beside a covered wagon on a piece of land he doesn't own yet, looking at his wife and 3 daughters like he's just given them a palace. What he's actually giving them is a hole in the ground. Let me take you to that exact moment. The moment when the Ingalls family arrived at Plum Creek and everything Laura would later write about in On the Banks of Plum Creek began. Not the book version. The real version. It's late May. The prairie grass is high, brushing against the wagon wheels as Charles drives them north from Walnut Grove. The town itself is barely 4 years old. A collection of wooden buildings, a general store, a few houses. The kind of place that could disappear in a decade if the railroad passed it by. Charles has been here before. He came ahead, scouted the land, found this property along Plum Creek. There's a small wheat field already planted by the previous occupant, a man named Anders Haraldson, though Laura will call him Mr. Hanson in her book. Why Haraldson left, we don't know. Maybe the land defeated him too. Maybe he saw what was coming with the grasshoppers and got out while he could. Smart man if so. But Charles doesn't know that yet. Charles sees opportunity. He sees 172 acres of land he can claim under preemption law. He sees Plum Creek winding through the property, which means water. He sees timber along the creek banks, which means fuel and building material. He sees that small wheat field, which means maybe, just maybe, they'll have a harvest this year without having to wait for seeds to grow. Caroline sees something different. Caroline, age 35, has been in this wagon for weeks. Again. She left Wisconsin. Again. Her family. Her friends. Her community. Again. Because Charles promised this time would be different. She's heard that before, but she doesn't say anything. What would be the point? The wagon is already here. The girls are already asking questions. Mary is 9, old enough to understand that this is another new start. Laura is 7, young enough to still believe Pa when he says everything will be wonderful. Carrie is 4. She doesn't understand anything except that Ma is tired and Pa is excited, and those 2 things are always true. The wagon stops near the creek. Charles climbs down first, then helps Caroline and the girls. And this is the moment. This is when they see what home is going to mean for the next several months. There's a depression in the south-facing bank of Plum Creek. The previous occupant had started digging a dugout. Maybe he'd lived in it. Maybe he'd just used it for storage. Either way, it's there. A hole. In the dirt. With a crude door frame. That's home. Now, Laura's book makes this sound almost magical. She describes it as a house in the high bank of Plum Creek, with a doorway and a window and a sense of snugness. She makes it sound like a fairy house, a hobbit hole, something from a storybook. Let me tell you what a dugout actually was. You dig into a hillside or creek bank carving out a room, 12 feet by 12 feet if you're lucky, maybe 14 by 14 if you're ambitious. The walls are raw earth, and if you're smart, you'll line them with sod blocks cut from prairie grass. Each block weighs about 50 pounds. You stack them like bricks, and the grass roots hold them together. The roof is the hard part. You need wooden poles. Cottonwood, if you can find it, because it's light enough to lift but strong enough to hold weight. You lay the poles side by side across the opening. Then you cover them with prairie grass for insulation. Then you put sod blocks on top. 2 layers if you can manage it. And here's what happens next. It rains. The sod absorbs water. The grass roots drink. And suddenly your roof is a garden. Grass sprouts, wildflowers bloom. If you're not careful, small animals burrow into it. Your ceiling is alive. Inside, the floor is dirt. Hard-packed if you're lucky and spend hours sprinkling it with water and sweeping it smooth. Muddy if you're not. The walls weep moisture. Beetles emerge from the earth at night. Mice tunnel through. Snakes sometimes appear, drawn by the warmth and the mice. There's one window, if the family saved enough money to buy glass in town. Otherwise, it's an opening covered with oiled paper that lets in light but not much else. The door is rough wood, hung on leather hinges because metal is expensive. Light is scarce. Air is stale. Privacy doesn't exist. But it's cool in summer. Genuinely cool. The Earth temperature stays around 55 degrees no matter how hot the surface gets. And in winter, it's easy to eat with minimal fuel. A small fire can warm the entire space because the earth walls hold the heat. So for pioneers arriving on treeless prairie with no money for lumber, a dugout made sense. But it was still poverty. It was the kind of house you lived in when you had no choice. And everyone knew it. Dugouts were markers of desperation, of starting over with nothing, of being at the bottom of the social ladder, looking up at families who could afford frame houses. Caroline Ingalls knew this. She'd taught school before marrying Charles. She'd grown up in a house with wooden floors and plastered walls. She'd had standards once. Now she was standing in front of a hole in the ground, watching her husband smile like he'd built her a mansion. What do you say in that moment? Laura never wrote about what Ma said. Maybe Caroline said nothing. Maybe she just nodded and started unpacking the wagon, the way she always did, the way she would do over and over for the next decade. But I wonder what she thought, standing there with 3 daughters and a husband whose dreams were always bigger than his ability to achieve them. I wonder if she looked at that dugout and thought, this is my life now. I wonder if she cried that first night, quietly, after the girls were asleep. Laura never wrote that part. Here's what Laura did write about, or at least what made it into the final published version. The adventure of living in the creek bank, playing in the tall grass, watching Pa plough the field, listening to the creek water, swimming in the deep pool downstream, and those things probably happened. Laura was 7. 7-year-olds can find magic in anything. A dugout home could be an adventure if your father told you it was. But here's what else was happening. The part Laura couldn't see or couldn't write about. Charles had to file his preemption claim immediately. The law was clear. You could claim up to 160 acres of unsurveyed public land, but you had 33 months to complete your purchase at $2.50 per acre. If you didn't pay, you lost everything. So on June 26th, 1874, less than a month after arriving, Charles went to the New Ulm Land Office and filed his declaratory statement. He was claiming 172 acres. That meant he owed $430. $430 in 1874. That's roughly $15,000 in 2026 money. Charles didn't have it. Nobody did. And preemption was designed for land speculators and established farmers who could pay cash. Poor families like the Ingalls had to gamble, file the claim, plant crops, pray for a good harvest, sell the wheat, and pay the government before the deadline. If the crops failed, you lost everything. The land, the house you'd built on it, the improvements you'd made, all of it went back to the government, and they sold it to the next dreamer. This is what Charles bet his family's future on in June 1874. A wheat harvest that hadn't sprouted yet, weather that might or might not cooperate, a deadline 33 months away, and grasshopper eggs buried in the soil from the previous year's plague just waiting to hatch. But Charles didn't know about the eggs yet. Or maybe he did, and he gambled anyway. Either way, he filed the claim. He put his family one step further into a bet they couldn't afford to lose. And then he started building. Not the dugout, that was already there, and they moved into it immediately. But Charles wasn't planning to keep his family in a hole in the ground. He was planning to build a real house, a frame house, something Caroline could be proud of. The question is when? According to the final proof papers he filed in June 1876, Charles swore under oath that he'd built a dwelling 20 feet by 24 feet and 10 feet high with 5 doors and 3 windows, and that he'd been living in it since June 20th to 26th, 1874. That timing is suspicious. The family arrived in late May 1874. The proof papers claim the frame house existed by late June. That's 4 weeks, maybe 5. Building a sawn lumber frame house with 5 doors and 3 windows in 4 weeks, while also ploughing virgin prairie and planting additional crops, seems nearly impossible, especially when you're also feeding a family and doing all the daily survival work the frontier required. So either Charles lied on his land papers, which was common because it strengthened your claim, or the family lived in the frame house much sooner than Laura's narrative suggests, which means the dugout phase was shorter than the books imply. Or, and this is what I suspect, Charles built the house over months, maybe a year, and backdated the papers to meet legal requirements. We can't know for sure. The documents and the literary memory don't align. They never do. But here's what we know for certain. The family lived in the dugout for at least some significant period in 1874. Long enough for 7-year-old Laura to form memories that would last 60 years. Long enough for it to become the central setting of an entire book. And while they lived there, they were poor. Genuinely, scrambling for food, poor. The wheat field that Anders Haraldsson had planted, it was small, maybe an acre, maybe 2. Even if it yielded well, it wouldn't be enough to pay the land claim. Charles needed to plough more land, plant more wheat, hope for a bigger harvest the next year. But ploughing virgin prairie by hand with a walking plough is back-breaking work. The roots of big blue-stem grass go down 6 feet. The soil is dense. Charles could maybe plough an acre a day if he worked from sunup to sundown and the weather cooperated. And ploughing was just the start. Then you had to harrow, plant, weed. Yeah, protect the crop from animals and weather and insects. It was endless. Caroline's work was endless too, but different. She was trying to make a dugout livable, trying to keep 3 daughters clean when the house was literally made of dirt, trying to cook meals with limited supplies, trying to preserve food for winter, trying to sew clothes, mend what could be mended, make do with what they had. The books make this sound cozy, pioneering. The reality was exhaustion. And then summer came in full. July in southwestern Minnesota is hot, 90 degrees, sometimes higher. The sun beats down on treeless prairie with nowhere to hide. The dugout stayed cool, which was its one advantage. But working outside, ploughing and planting and hauling water was brutal. And the grasshoppers were there, not the massive swarms yet. But the eggs from 1873 had hatched. Young hoppers, millions of them, crawling through the grass. Charles and the neighbours knew what it meant. They tried everything, dragging heavy ropes through the fields to crush the insects, digging trenches and filling them with coal tar, setting fires. Nothing worked. By late July, the young grasshoppers had eaten significant portions of the new crops. Not everything, not yet. But enough to make Charles nervous. Enough to make him wonder if the harvest would be sufficient. And then, in early August, the adult grasshoppers flew away. Just left. Headed north and west to breeding grounds in Montana and Wyoming. The farmers exhaled. Maybe they'd survived. Maybe the worst was over. They didn't know that the departing grasshoppers had laid eggs, millions and millions of eggs, while buried in the soil of every field and prairie plot in southwestern Minnesota. Eggs that would hatch the next summer. But in August 1874, Charles didn't know that. He saw the insects leave and thought maybe they were done. Maybe next year would be better. He went to church in Walnut Grove and thanked God for their deliverance. Caroline went with him, and they brought the girls in their best dresses. Laura remembered this. She remembered the church, the congregation, the sense of community. She remembered feeling like maybe finally they belonged somewhere. And maybe that's why she wrote about Walnut Grove the way she did. Not because it was easy, not because they succeeded, but because for a brief window between the grasshoppers leaving in August 1874 and returning in June 1875, they had hope. Hope is what you remember when you're 65 and looking back at a hard life. Not the hunger, not the fear, the hope. Even if it didn't last, especially if it didn't last. Because here's the thing about that first summer on Plum Creek. It was the best it would ever be. The small wheat field yielded enough for the family to eat through winter and sell a little surplus. Charles got occasional work in town doing carpentry. Caroline took in sewing. The girls played. They made friends with the Nelson and Ensign families who lived nearby. For a few months it looked like Charles's gamble might pay off, and then winter came, and the winter of 1874 to 1875 was hard. Not the legendary hard winter that would hit De Smet in 1880 to 1881, but hard enough. Deep snow, bitter cold, weeks when Charles couldn't get to town for supplies. The dugout stayed warm at least. Small mercies. Spring 1875 arrived and Charles ploughed more land. He was optimistic. He'd made it through one winter. The small harvest had kept them fed. This year would be bigger, better. He'd plant more acres, get a bigger yield, start paying down the debt. That's what he told Caroline. That's what he told himself. And then June came. And with June came a sound that Laura would remember for the rest of her life. The sound of wings. Millions and millions of wings. A roar like wind, like a storm, like the end of the world. The grasshoppers were back, and this time they were hungry. But that's a story for the next chapter, because right now I want you to hold on to something. Laura Ingalls. Wilder spent her first summer in Minnesota in a house made of dirt, watching her father bet everything on weather and luck and hope. She was 7 years old. She played in the creek. She helped Ma with chores. She probably didn't fully understand how close to the edge they were, but she remembered the dugout. She remembered the feeling of being half buried in the earth. She remembered the sound of the creek at night and the smell of prairie grass and the taste of food, cooked over a tiny stove in an earthen room. And 60 years later, she turned it into a children's book about adventure and family and making do with what you have. She left out the fear. She left out Caroline's exhaustion. She left out the fact that they were one bad harvest away from losing everything. She made it beautiful, and maybe that's what survival requires. Taking the parts that hurt and reshaping them until they mean something, until they teach something, until they become a story that someone else can hold on to when their own life gets hard. Laura survived that summer. That's the important part, but barely. And the next summer would be worse. The sound came first. That's what every account says. Every farmer who survived it, every newspaper that covered it, every child who grew up to write about it. The sound came before you could see anything. A roar, low and steady, like distant thunder that doesn't stop, like wind except the air is still, like something massive approaching from far away getting closer. You're standing in a wheat field in June 1875. You're Charles Ingalls, and you've spent the last year pouring everything into this land. You ploughed virgin prairie until your hands bled. You planted every seed you could afford. You watched the wheat sprout grow knee-high, turn that perfect shade of green that means maybe finally you'll make it. And now you hear that sound. You look west. The sky is wrong. It's not clouds. Clouds move differently. This is a darkness that glitters, a darkness that hums, a darkness that's coming straight toward your field. And you know in your gut what it is, but your brain refuses to accept it because accepting it means everything you've worked for is about to die. The grasshoppers are back, but this time they're not the young hoppers that hatched last summer and flew away. These are adults, millions of them, billions of them, coming from breeding grounds in Montana and Wyoming, riding the wind currents east, looking for food, and they're hungry. The Minnesota Historical Society records describe what happened next with clinical precision. On June 12th, 1873, the first wave hit. But 1874 was worse. And 1875? 1875 was apocalyptic. The swarms were so dense they blocked the sun. Eyewitnesses said it looked like a snowstorm except the snow was alive. The insects landed on everything. Fields, roofs, fences, people. They covered the ground so thickly you couldn't walk without crunching through layers of them. And then they ate. Not just the wheat. Everything. They ate the vegetable gardens down to bare dirt. They ate every leaf off the trees. They ate the prairie grass down to the roots, leaving the landscape looking like it had been burned. They ate laundry hanging on clotheslines. They ate leather harnesses, boots, belts. They chewed through wooden fence posts and tool handles drawn by the salt from human sweat absorbed into the wood. Contemporary accounts describe farmers covering plants with blankets to protect them. The grasshoppers ate the blankets. They described the insects crawling into houses through every crack and gap. Women trying to cook while brushing grasshoppers off the stove. Children crying as insects landed in their hair, on their faces. The roar of wings was constant, day and night. The sound of millions of insects chewing was constant, and the smell. Rotting vegetation, insect waste, death. Laura was 8 years old when this happened. 8 years old, standing outside the dugout or the frame house, watching her father run into the wheat field trying to save something, anything. She remembered it. She remembered all of it. On the Banks of Plum Creek, she wrote about the grasshoppers, but she made it an adventure. She described them as a curiosity. She wrote about Pa trying to save the wheat, about Ma being brave, about the family enduring. What she didn't write was the despair. Charles Ingalls stood in his field and watched 3 years of work disappear in 3 days. The wheat he'd planted, the garden Caroline had tended, the hay he'd cut for winter feed, gone. And this time, he knew. He knew the grasshoppers would lay eggs before they left. He knew they'd be back next summer. He knew that even if he planted again, even if he somehow scraped together enough money for seed, the insects would return and eat that crop too. There was no winning. Financial math was brutal. Charles had filed his preemption claim in June 1874. Then he had 33 months to pay the government $413 for the land. That deadline was approaching. March 1877. Without a wheat harvest, he couldn't pay. Without payment, he'd lose the land and the house he'd built on it. Everything. So what do you do when you're trapped? When staying means slow starvation and leaving means admitting failure? Charles didn't know yet, but Caroline did. Caroline had been here before, not with grasshoppers, but with failure, with packing up and leaving, with starting over. She'd done it in Wisconsin, in Kansas, back to Wisconsin. Now Minnesota was failing too. She didn't say, "I told you so." That wasn't her way. But she must have thought it. She must have looked at Charles and thought, this is what happens when you chase dreams instead of accepting what's real. But she didn't say it. She just started figuring out how to feed her family with no crops and no money. The community tried to help. Walnut Grove was a small town, but it had churches. The English Lutheran church that the Ingalls attended organised relief efforts. Neighbours shared what little they had. The state government eventually allocated some money for grasshopper bounties, paying farmers 50 cents per gallon of grasshopper eggs collected, or $1 per bushel of live hoppers caught before May 25th. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Families left. Wagons rolled east out of southwestern Minnesota all through the summer and fall of 1875. People who'd invested everything, lost everything, going back to whatever they'd left behind, or heading to cities to find work, or just disappearing into the vastness of a country that didn't care whether they succeeded or failed. Charles didn't leave, not yet. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was shame, maybe he'd moved so many times already that one more move felt like admitting his entire life was a failure. So he stayed. He took odd jobs in Walnut Grove, carpentry work mostly. Charles was skilled with his hands when he focused. He could build, repair, make furniture. It didn't pay much, but it kept the family fed. Caroline took in sewing. She was good with a needle, fast and precise. She could take in a dress or let out a pair of pants or patchwork shirts. Women in town brought her their mending, and she did it in the evenings by lamplight after the girls were asleep. This is how they survived the summer and fall of 1875. Not through farming, through wage labour and piecework and the charity of neighbours. It's also how they survived the winter of 1875 to 1876. And then spring came again. Spring 1876. Charles looked at his fields and had a choice. Plant again, knowing the grasshoppers would likely return or give up on farming entirely. He planted. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was denial. Maybe he couldn't imagine any other life than farming. He'd been raised on a farm. His father had been a farmer. The entire mythology of America said that men who worked the land were virtuous, independent, successful. Charles planted wheat. The grasshoppers came back in June 1876. This was the worst year. 40 counties in Minnesota affected. 500,000 acres of crops destroyed. Now $2 million in losses. Farmers stood in their fields and wept. Some of them gave up entirely, abandoned their claims, walked away. Charles didn't walk away. But he made a decision. On July 7th, 1876, he went to the New Ulm Land Office and converted his preemption claim to a cash purchase. He paid the government $413, money he'd borrowed, money he'd scraped together from carpentry work and Caroline's sewing and probably loans from neighbours or family. He bought the land, and then, that same day, he sold it. Abraham Keller purchased the 172 acres for $400. $13 less than Charles had just paid the government. $13. That was the profit from 2 years of backbreaking work. 2 years of ploughing and planting and watching crops die. 2 years of living in a dugout and then a frame house that Charles had built with his own hands. $13. Actually, it was a $13 loss, because Charles had invested far more than $413. He'd invested time and labour and materials. He'd invested hope. But the math didn't care about hope. The math said he'd failed. Why did Abraham Keller want the land? Maybe he had more capital to weather the grasshopper years. Maybe he was speculating that the plagues would end and land values would rise. Maybe he just saw an opportunity to buy improved land with a house already built on it. We don't know. What we know is that Charles took the $400 and started making plans to leave Minnesota. But here's the part that Laura never wrote about in the published books. The part that only appears in the original Pioneer Girl manuscript. The family didn't leave immediately. They stayed through the rest of the summer of 1876. Charles worked. Caroline sewed. The girls played along Plum Creek, unaware that their father had just sold their home out from under them. And in August 1876, something happened that would break the family in a way even the grasshoppers couldn't. Caroline was pregnant. She'd been pregnant through the grasshopper plague years. And on November 1st, 1875, she gave birth to a son, Charles Frederick Ingalls, the only son. The boy Charles had wanted for years. They called him Freddie. He was a healthy baby at birth. But 9 months later, in August 1876, as the family prepared to leave Minnesota, Freddie got sick. The records aren't clear on what killed him. It might have been cholera, and it might have been dysentery. It might have been any of the dozens of diseases that swept through frontier communities and killed children before anyone could do anything to save them. Freddie died, aged 9 months. The family was somewhere between Walnut Grove and South Troy, Minnesota, where Caroline's relatives lived, when it happened. They buried him in or near South Troy. The exact grave location is uncertain. The records from that time and place are incomplete. Laura was 9 years old enough to understand that her baby brother was dead, old enough to remember. And when she sat down 60 years later to write the Little House books, she left Freddie out entirely. She never mentioned him, not once, not in On the Banks of Plum Creek, not in any of the other books. A reader who only knew the Little House series would have no idea Laura had a brother who died as an infant. Why? Maybe it hurt too much to write about. Maybe Rose, editing the manuscripts, convinced her it was too dark for children's literature. Maybe Laura decided that a story about pioneers enduring hardship could include grasshoppers and crop failure, but not dead babies. Or maybe she just wanted to give readers, and herself, a version of her childhood where everyone lived, where the family stayed intact, where loss was temporary and survivable. But Freddie died. That's real. That's documented. And his death happened at the exact moment when the family was leaving Minnesota, when Charles's dream of successful farming was collapsing, when everything they'd worked for had turned to dust. So when the family left Minnesota in August 1876, they weren't just leaving because of the grasshoppers. They were leaving because their son had died, because Charles had failed, because Caroline couldn't bear to stay in a place where she'd buried a child. They went to Burr Oak, Iowa. Charles had a friend there who owned a hotel, the Masters Hotel. The friend offered Charles work managing the place. It wasn't farming, it was wage labour, but it was stable. Regular income, a roof over their heads. Caroline must have been relieved. A job that didn't depend on weather or insects. A town with a school for the girls. A chance to stay in one place. They lived in Burr Oak for about a year. Charles and Caroline ran the hotel. It was hard work, long hours, dealing with travellers, cooking, cleaning, managing rooms. Charles hated it. He wasn't meant for indoor work, for service work, for taking orders and being polite to strangers. He missed the land. He missed the independence of farming, even though farming had destroyed them. After a few months, the family moved out of the hotel and into rooms above a grocery store, then into a small brick house on the edge of town. Charles was looking for a way out, for the next opportunity, the next dream, and in May 1877, while they were living in that brick house in Burr Oak, Caroline gave birth to another daughter, Grace Pearl Ingalls, Grace, who would survive, who would grow up and marry and live a long life. Grace, who replaced Freddie in the family lineup, though of course no child truly replaces another. Laura loved Grace. She wrote about her in the later books, but she never wrote about Freddie. Meanwhile, so back in Minnesota, something was happening. In April 1877, the Minnesota government declared a day of prayer. Governor John S. Pillsbury, responding to pleas from desperate farmers, asked every person in the state to pray for relief from the grasshoppers. April 26, 1877. Churches across Minnesota held special services. Catholics in Cold Spring, Stearns County, built Assumption Chapel as a devotional offering to God, asking for deliverance. And then, in late April, a massive snowstorm swept through the state. An unseasonable spring blizzard. It killed millions of grasshopper eggs that had been laid the previous summer. And in August 1877, the remaining grasshoppers flew away. The survivors left Minnesota and never came back. People called it a miracle. They said God had answered their prayers. Churches credited divine intervention. And scientists now know it wasn't a miracle. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanopus spretus, was already in decline. Farmers had been unknowingly destroying the insect's breeding grounds by ploughing up the river valleys where the females laid their eggs. The species was heading toward extinction. By 1902, the Rocky Mountain locust was completely extinct. The last confirmed sighting was in southern Canada in the early 1900s. A species that had once formed swarms so large they blocked the sun was gone forever. But in 1877, people didn't know that. They just knew the grasshoppers had left, that they could plant crops again without fear, that maybe finally they could succeed. Charles heard about this in Iowa. He heard that the grasshoppers were gone, that Minnesota was recovering, that land prices were reasonable and opportunities were returning. And Caroline, who probably wanted nothing more than to stay in one place, must have closed her eyes and prepared herself, because she knew Charles. She knew what he was thinking. They went back. In 1878, the Ingalls family returned to Walnut Grove. Not to the farm. Charles had sold that. But to the town itself. They moved into a house in town. Charles worked as a storekeeper, a butcher, a carpenter. Caroline was probably relieved. Town life meant neighbours. It meant schools. It meant the girls could have some stability. And for a while, it worked. The town of Walnut Grove was growing. It officially incorporated on March 13th, 1879. Charles Ingalls was elected Justice of the Peace, a position of respect, of standing in the community. For a brief window, Charles and Caroline had what they'd always wanted, a home, a community, stability. And then Mary got sick. Spring 1879. Mary Ingalls, age 14, contracted an illness. The books say it was scarlet fever, followed by a stroke that left her blind. Medical research suggests it was more likely viral meningoencephalitis, an infection that caused inflammation of the brain and optic nerve damage. The result was the same. Mary lost her sight completely. At 14 years old, Mary's entire future changed. No more reading, no more teaching, which had been her dream. No more independence. The family was devastated. Caroline especially. Mary had been her firstborn, her gentle, obedient, studious daughter, and now she was blind. There was a school for the blind in Iowa College for the blind in Vinton, but it cost money. Money the family didn't have. So Caroline started saving. Every penny from Charles's work, every cent from her sewing. They would send Mary to school. They would give her a chance at a life. But that meant more money, more work, more pressure on Charles to provide. And then, in the fall of 1879, Charles's sister Dosia wrote with an offer. Her husband worked for the railroad company pushing west into Dakota Territory. They were building a town called De Smet. The company needed men, The pay was good. There were opportunities. Charles read the letter and saw another chance. Another fresh start. Another place where maybe finally things would be different. Caroline didn't want to go. She wanted to stay in Walnut Grove. She'd made friends. She had a church community. She had a house in town. For once in her married life, where she wasn't living in a hole in the ground or a claim shanty in the middle of nowhere. But Mary needed money for school, and Charles needed something he could never quite name. A restlessness, a need to keep moving, a belief that the next place would be better than this place. In the fall of 1879, the family packed up again. They left Walnut Grove for the last time, headed west to Dakota Territory, to De Smet, where they would finally, after 15 years of wandering, stay put. But that's not tonight's story. Tonight's story is about Minnesota, about Plum Creek, about a family that tried and tried again and failed again, about grasshoppers that changed the course of lives, about a baby boy who died and was erased from the story, about a woman who buried a son and kept going because what else could she do, about a man who bet everything on dreams and lost, but couldn't stop dreaming, and about a 7-year-old girl who watched it all, remembered it all, and 60 years later decided which parts to tell. The grasshoppers destroyed Charles Ingalls' crops, but they couldn't destroy the story Laura would build from the ruins, even if that story wasn't quite true, even if it left out the parts that hurt too much to say. The truth is still there, buried in land records and census data and the depression in the ground where a dugout used to be. You just have to know where to look. Here's what you see when you visit the Ingalls dugout site today. A working farm. Fields of corn or soybeans depending on the season. A gravel driveway leading to a small visitor centre. A modest admission fee. And then a walk down a gentle slope toward Plum Creek. The creek is still there. Still narrow and meandering. Still lined with trees. It looks exactly like something from a storybook. Peaceful. Pastoral. The kind of place where you can imagine a family making a life. And then you see the dugout site. It's a depression in the south-facing creek bank, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. The earth has settled over the decades, but the outline is still visible. A shallow indent where walls used to be. A sense of space that was once enclosed. That's all that's left. No structure, no roof, no door. Just a dent in the ground and a marker explaining what it was. And if you're standing there, if you've driven from somewhere far away because you loved the Little House books as a child, you might feel something strange. A disconnect between what you expected and what you're seeing. Because the books made it sound bigger. Made it sound like a real house. Made it sound like an adventure. But standing there, looking at that depression in the ground, you realise something Laura never quite said outright. This was poverty. The Gordon family has owned this property since 1947. Harold and Della Gordon bought the 172-acre farm, not knowing it had any historical significance. They were farmers. They needed land. And then, in November 1947, a man showed up at their door. His name was Garth Williams. He was an illustrator. He'd been hired to create new illustrations for the Little House books, replacing the original artwork. And he wanted to see the actual places Laura had written about so his drawings would be accurate. Garth Williams walked down to Plum Creek with Harold Gordon and pointed at the depression in the bank. "That's it," he said. "That's the dugout." Harold Gordon had been farming that land for months and never realised. Just a dent in the ground. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Garth Williams had done his research. He'd read Laura's descriptions carefully. He knew what to look for. And suddenly the Gordon family owned a piece of American literary history. They could have closed it off, kept it private, treated it like any other part of their working farm. Instead, they started allowing visitors. At first, it was just a few people, fans of the books who wrote letters asking if they could see the site. The Gordons said yes. No fee, just people who wanted to stand where Laura had stood. But word spread. More people came. By the 1960s and 70s, especially after the TV show started airing in 1974, it became a steady stream. Families on vacation, school groups, die-hard fans making pilgrimages. The Gordons eventually started charging a small fee. Not to get rich, just to manage the wear and tear on the property, to maintain paths, to keep the site accessible, and they've maintained it with remarkable care. The current generation of Gordons still lives on the property, still farms it, still welcomes visitors who want to connect with a story that shaped their childhoods. But here's the complicated part. What are those visitors connecting with? The real history or the myth? Because when most people visit the Dugout site, they're not thinking about Charles Ingalls filing a preemption claim he couldn't afford to pay. They're not thinking about 3 consecutive years of crop failure. They're not thinking about a 9-month-old baby dying somewhere nearby. They're thinking about Pa's fiddle, about Ma's simple meals that were somehow always enough, about Laura and Mary playing by the creek. They're thinking about the TV show, where Michael Landon played a father who was gentle and wise and always did the right thing, where Karen Grassel played a mother who was patient and beautiful and never exhausted, where the Prairie looked golden and the challenges were always overcome by the end of the episode. The TV show ran for 9 seasons, 1974 to 1983. It became more famous than the books. An entire generation of Americans learned about the Ingalls family not from Laura's writing, but from network television. And the TV show took liberties. The real Charles Ingalls was 5 feet 9 inches tall and probably around 160 pounds. Michael Landon was 6 feet tall and built like someone who worked out in a gym. The real Charles had a restless streak that bordered on reckless. TV Charles was steady and wise. The real Caroline was tired. Bone tired. Woman who's had 4 children in 12 years and moved 8 times tired. TV Caroline was serene. Her hair was always perfect. Her dresses were always clean. The real Laura was sharp-tongued and observant and probably more than a little bitter about her childhood, even if she turned that bitterness into art. Yes, TV Laura was plucky and sweet and learned lessons about kindness every week. The show made the frontier safe, manageable, a place where good people who worked hard always succeeded. The real frontier killed people. It bankrupted families. It destroyed dreams. It took children and gave nothing back. But you can't make a primetime family drama about that. So the show did what Laura had already done in the books. It softened everything, made it palatable, turned suffering into character development and failure into temporary setbacks. And millions of people watched it and thought, this is what the frontier was like. This is what America was built on. Except it wasn't. Now, I'm not saying the show was evil or wrong. It gave people something they needed. Hope. A sense that families could endure anything if they stuck together. A vision of America that felt wholesome and aspirational, but it buried the real history even deeper than Laura had. Because at least Laura knew she was changing things. She made conscious choices about what to include and exclude. She wrestled with those choices. You can see it in the differences between the Pioneer Girl manuscript and the published books. The TV show writers probably never read the land records, never checked the census data, never asked hard questions about why the Ingalls family moved so many times or how they actually survived financially. They just took Laura's already softened version and softened it more. And now, when you visit the Dugout site, you're visiting a place that exists in 3 versions simultaneously. The real place, where a family lived in poverty in a hole in the ground because they had no other choice. The literary place, where Laura transformed that poverty into a story about resilience and family and making do. The television place, where everything was an adventure and everyone learned valuable lessons and the prairie was golden. Which version do visitors see when they look at that depression in the ground? I think most see all 3 at once, and that's what makes it so powerful and so strange. You're standing in a real place. Your feet are on actual ground. The creek behind you is the same creek Laura waded in. The trees, or their descendants, are the same trees, but you're also standing in a story. Multiple stories, layered on top of each other like sediment, and you can feel the weight of all those stories. All those people who came before you, trying to connect with something, trying to understand the past, trying to find meaning in a depression in the ground that represents both suffering and survival. The Walnut Grove town itself has leaned into this complicated legacy. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum is there. The pageant happens every summer, where locals perform scenes from the books. Tour buses come through. Gift shops sell sunbonnets and rag dolls and commemorative plates. It's a tourism economy built on nostalgia for a version of the past that never quite existed. And here's the ethical question that historians and museum professionals have been wrestling with for decades. Do you tell visitors the truth? All of it? The poverty and the failures and the dead baby and the illegal land claims and the racism in Laura's books? Or do you give them what they came for? The warm feeling, the connection to their childhood, the sense that simple values and hard work really do matter? The Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum has tried to walk that line. They have exhibits about the real history. Land claim documents on display, census records, photographs, information about the grasshopper plagues and the economic realities of homesteading. But they also have the cozy stuff, reproductions of Laura's dresses, a covered wagon kids can climb into, quilts and bonnets and all the tactile pieces of the myth, and most visitors probably engage with both. They read the hard history, they acknowledge it, and then they go to the gift shop and buy a sunbonnet anyway. Because people need myths. We need stories that make sense of suffering. We need narratives that tell us hardship has meaning. Laura understood that. That's why she wrote the books the way she did. Not to deceive people, but to give them something to hold on to. The problem is when the myth becomes the only version people know. When the story replaces the history so completely that we forget there was ever a difference. And that's what happened with Little House. For decades, millions of American schoolchildren read those books as history. Teachers assigned them in social studies units about westward expansion. Kids wrote reports about pioneer life based entirely on Laura's fictionalized accounts. And nobody pushed back. Nobody said, wait, these are novels. Autobiographical novels, but novels nonetheless. They're one woman's selective memory, thus filtered through 60 years and heavy editorial intervention. Nobody said that because the books felt true. They had details, sensory descriptions, emotional authenticity. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. In recent years, that's finally changing. Scholars like Pamela Smith-Hill, who edited the Pioneer Girl annotated edition, have done meticulous work comparing Laura's manuscripts to historical records. Historians have contextualized the Ingalls family's experience within broader patterns of homestead failures and frontier economic realities. The result is a much more complicated picture. The Ingalls family were not heroes. They were not villains. They were people, flawed, struggling, sometimes making terrible decisions people. Charles Ingalls was a dreamer whose dreams hurt his family. But he was also a man who worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide. Both things are true. Caroline Ingalls was probably frustrated and exhausted, and maybe even resentful. But she also held the family together through impossible circumstances. Both things are true. Laura Ingalls Wilder created a mythology that erased important truths. But she also created art that brought comfort to millions. Both things are true. And that's what you're really visiting when you go to the Dugout site. Not just a place, but the complicated space between truth and myth. Between memory and history. Between what happened and what we say happened. The depression in the ground is real. The suffering that happened there was real. But so is the story. The beautiful, imperfect story that Laura crafted from that suffering. And maybe both deserve to exist. The history for those who want to understand. The myth for those who need something to hold on to. The question is whether we can hold both at once. Whether we can acknowledge that the books are fiction, while still valuing what they give us. Whether we can stand in that depression in the ground and feel both the poverty and the story. I think we can. I think we have to. Because the alternative is choosing one or the other. Either dismissing the books as lies, which would be tragic because they're genuinely beautiful literature, or accepting them as truth, which would be irresponsible because they're not. The middle path is harder. It requires nuance. It requires sitting with discomfort. It requires standing in a depression in the ground and saying, a family lived here in poverty. And from that poverty, a woman created a story that shaped American consciousness. Both of those facts matter. That's what the best museum exhibits and historical sites are starting to do. Holding both. Presenting the documented facts alongside the literary creation. Letting visitors sit with the tension. Because that tension is where real understanding happens. When you visit the Dugout site today, you'll see that depression in the ground. You'll read the historical markers. You'll walk down to the creek and maybe dip your fingers in the water the way Laura did. And you might feel disappointed at first, because it's just a dent in the dirt, not impressive, not magical. But if you stand there long enough, if you really think about what happened in that space, a family of 5 living in a 12 by 12 room carved into a creek bank, a mother trying to keep her daughters clean and fed, a father betting everything on wheat that would die 3 summers in a row, a 7-year-old girl absorbing every detail, remembering everything, knowing somehow that she'd need these memories later. If you think about all of that, the depression in the ground becomes something else. It becomes the place where American mythology and American reality collided, where poverty was transformed into literature, where suffering became story. And that's worth visiting. That's worth preserving. Not because the myth is true, but because the gap between the myth and the truth tells us something essential about who we are, about how we remember, how we forget, how we decide which stories to keep and which to bury. Laura buried some stories, the dead baby, the worst of the poverty, the most painful failures. But she couldn't bury the Dugout, it's still there, a physical fact that won't disappear no matter how many books get written or TV shows produced. And as long as that depression in the ground exists, there's a chance for people to ask the hard questions. Why did they live like this? What systemic failures led to families dwelling in holes in creek banks? What happened to the indigenous people whose land this was first? What's the real cost of the mythology we've built around westward expansion? Those questions matter. They matter more than the myth, honestly, but the myth matters too, because stories shape us. The narratives we tell about our past determine how we understand our present. Laura Ingalls Wilder gave America a story about itself, a story of pioneer families overcoming hardship through love and determination, a story that said hard work pays off and virtue is rewarded. That story isn't true, not historically, not systematically. But millions of people needed it to be true, especially during the Great Depression when the books were published, especially during the difficult 1970s when the TV show aired. And maybe some people still need it to be true, which means the rest of us have a responsibility. A responsibility to let the myth exist while also insisting on the history. To visit the Dugout site and feel both the story and the suffering. To stand in that depression in the ground and remember that a real family struggled here, and that from their struggle came art, imperfect art, fiction masquerading as memory, but art nonetheless. And art, even imperfect art, has the power to change how we see the world. Laura changed how America sees its frontier past, for better and worse. Now it's up to us to look clearly at what she did, to honour both the creation and the truth she obscured while creating it. That's the real visit. That's the real pilgrimage. Not to a myth, but to the complicated, messy human truth beneath it. And maybe, standing in that depression in the ground, we can start to tell better stories. Stories that don't erase the hardship, don't soften the edges, don't leave out the parts that hurt. Stories that are true enough to matter. That's what Laura gave us in the end, not truth, but the template for how to turn life into story. Now we get to decide what stories we tell next. The stories we tell next should probably start with the women who kept no journals. Caroline Ingalls never wrote a book, never published her memoirs, never sat down in her 60s to transform her life into literature that would outlive her. She just lived and survived, and held her family together through circumstances that would have broken most people. And then she died, December 20th, 1924, age 84, in De Smet, South Dakota, 45 years after leaving Walnut Grove for the last time. By the time she died, her daughter Laura was 57 years old, still farming in Missouri with Almanzo, still poor, still struggling, still years away from the success that the Little House books would bring. Caroline never knew her daughter would become famous, never knew that millions of people would read about her life, her cooking, her patience, her quiet endurance. Never knew that she'd become Ma to generations of readers who would think they knew her, but they didn't know her, not really. Because Laura's Caroline, the Caroline in the books, is a character, a simplified version, the patient mother who never complains, who keeps a clean house in impossible circumstances, who trusts her husband's decisions even when those decisions destroy the family's security over and over again. The real Caroline was more complicated than that. Let me tell you what we know about Caroline Lake Quiner before she became Mrs. Charles Ingalls. She was born in 1839 in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Her father, Henry Quiner, died in a shipwreck on Lake Michigan when Caroline was 5 years old. Her mother, Charlotte, was left to raise 5 children alone with no income and no safety net. Charlotte did it. She remarried eventually to Frederick Holbrook and the family survived. But those early years taught Caroline something essential, that women's security depended entirely on circumstances beyond their control, that a single disaster could destroy everything, that survival required constant vigilance and the ability to make do with almost nothing. Caroline grew up poor, not frontier poor, established community poor. The kind of poverty where you have neighbours who notice and judge, where you wear hand-me-downs and everyone knows it, where you're always one step away from charity and shame. She escaped through education. She became a teacher. In the 1850s, that was one of the few respectable paths for unmarried women. You taught in rural schools for a few years, saved what little money you could, and hoped to marry someone who could provide stability. Caroline met Charles Ingalls when she was 20. He was 24. He was charming, handsome, good with his hands. He played the fiddle and told stories and made her laugh, and he had dreams. Oh, did he have dreams? They married on February 1st, 1860. Caroline was 21. I wonder if she had any idea what she was signing up for. Because here's what the next 20 years looked like for Caroline Ingalls, 1860 to 1862, living in a log cabin in Pepin, Wisconsin. First daughter Mary, born in 1865, 1867. Second daughter Laura, born, still in Wisconsin, 1868 to 1869. Charles gets restless, talks about Kansas, about free land, about opportunity. 1869, Caroline packs up everything. Again, they move to Kansas, settle illegally on Osage land. 1870, third daughter Carrie, born in Kansas. Living in a house Charles built on land they have no right to. 1870 to 1871, federal government enforces treaty. Family forced to leave. Everything Charles built, wasted. 1871, back to Wisconsin. Caroline probably thinking, we should have stayed here in the first place. 1874, Charles hears about Minnesota, about land along Plum Creek. Caroline packs, again. 1874 to 1876, the grasshopper years. Crop failure, poverty, living in a dugout. Son Freddie born, then dies. 1876, leave Minnesota for Iowa. Living in a hotel, then above a store, then a brick house. 1877, fourth daughter, Grace born. 1878 to 1879, back to Minnesota. Town life in Walnut Grove. Mary goes blind. The only period of relative stability, and even that doesn't last. 1879, Charles wants to move to Dakota Territory. Caroline doesn't. They move anyway. 20 years, 8 moves. 4 births. 1 death. Constant financial instability. And through all of it, Caroline had to make it work. She had to cook meals with whatever food was available. She had to keep children clean when the house was made of dirt. She had to preserve food for winters. She had to sew all the family's clothes by hand. She had to teach the girls their letters because schools were scarce on the frontier. She had to be nurse, teacher, cook, seamstress, gardener, and emotional anchor. And she had to do it while watching her husband make decision after decision that put the family at risk. Because let's be clear about something. Charles's moves weren't always necessary. They weren't always rational. They were often impulsive, driven by restlessness rather than genuine opportunity. Other families stayed in Wisconsin and did fine. Other families stayed in Minnesota after the grasshoppers left and rebuilt. Other families made it work. But Charles couldn't sit still, and Caroline had no power to make him. In 1870s America, married women had almost no legal rights. A wife couldn't own property in her own name in most states, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't make major decisions about the family's future. If her husband decided to move, she moved. If he decided to sell the land, it was sold. Caroline's opinions didn't legally matter. We don't know what she said to Charles in private. Laura never wrote about those conversations. Maybe there weren't any. Maybe Caroline had learned early that arguing was pointless. Maybe she just packed the wagon every time and said nothing. Or maybe she fought. Maybe she cried. Maybe she begged him to stop moving. To think about the girls. To choose stability over dreams. We'll never know. Because Caroline kept no diary, left no letters. Her voice exists only in Laura's filtered memory and literary reconstruction. But we can infer some things from what we do know. Caroline was educated. She valued education highly. She taught the girls to read and write before they ever saw the inside of a school. And when Mary went blind, Caroline didn't give up. She started saving immediately to send Mary to college. To the Iowa College for the Blind, where Mary could learn skills that would give her independence despite her disability. That tells us something about Caroline's priorities, about her understanding that education was the path to security, the path she'd taken herself. Caroline also kept the family connected to community, every place they lived. She found a church, got involved, made friends. The family's social life, their support network, came through Caroline's efforts. When they were struggling in Walnut Grove during the grasshopper years, it was Caroline's church connections that brought them help. Neighbours sharing food, relief efforts organised through congregations, the social safety net that kept families from complete destitution. Charles provided the labour, Caroline provided the social capital. And when they finally settled into Smeat in 1879, when they finally stopped moving, it was Caroline who turned that claim shanty into a home, who built relationships in the new town, who made sure the girls had schooling and social opportunities. De Smet is where the family finally succeeded, where Charles held a series of town jobs, where they eventually bought a house in town and lived there for the rest of their lives. But that success came after Caroline had spent 20 years building the foundation, 20 years of social connections, 20 years of teaching the girls skills that would help them survive, 20 years of making do with nothing and turning it into something. Laura wrote about Pa's work, Pa building houses, Pa ploughing fields, Pa hunting. But Ma's work was invisible, endless, exhausting, and critically, Ma's work is what actually kept the family alive. Because here's the truth about frontier agriculture in the 1870s. Most families failed. The Homestead Act, signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, promised that any adult citizen could claim 160 acres of public land, live on it for 5 years, make improvements, and own it free and clear. It sounded like opportunity, like democracy, like the American dream made real. But the failure rate was catastrophic. Historians estimate that 60% of homestead claims failed. 60%. More than half the families who tried to make it on the frontier couldn't do it. Why? Because 160 acres wasn't enough in semi-arid regions. Because ploughing virgin prairie was backbreaking work that required expensive equipment most families didn't have. Because one bad season could wipe you out. Because isolation was crushing. Because medical care was non-existent. Because the weather was brutal. Because insects could destroy everything in days. Because the entire system was designed for people with capital, with savings, with backup plans. Poor families like the Ingalls had none of that. They were gambling with borrowed money on crops that might fail, living in temporary shelters that barely protected them from the elements, surviving on credit and hope. And when it didn't work, when the crops failed or the weather turned or the grasshoppers came, those families had to leave, had to start over somewhere else, or give up on farming entirely and become wage labourers in towns. The Ingalls family tried farming for decades and never succeeded at it, not once. Their survival came from wage work, from Caroline's sewing, from Charles's carpentry, from odd jobs and community support and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. But that's not the story Laura told in the books. In the books, the frontier is hard but manageable. The family always has enough to eat. They always make it through. Pa's work on the land is portrayed as virtuous and meaningful, even when it fails. There's no acknowledgement that the entire system was broken, that the Homestead Act was a well-intentioned policy that destroyed as many families as it helped, that the push to settle the West ignored environmental realities and resulted in widespread suffering. Laura couldn't write that in children's books in the 1930s. Nobody wanted to hear it. But it was true, and Caroline knew it. Caroline, who spent decades watching her husband chase farming dreams that never panned out. Caroline, who had to figure out how to feed her daughters when there was no harvest to sell. Caroline, who buried a baby somewhere in Minnesota and just kept going because what else could she do? If Caroline had written a book, what would it have said? Maybe it would have been about the cost of men's dreams, about women's unpaid labour, about the violence of constant displacement, about grief that couldn't be acknowledged because there was too much work to do. Maybe it would have been angry, bitter, raw, or maybe it would have been like Laura's books. Maybe Caroline too would have softened it, made it bearable, turned suffering into story. We'll never know. What we do know is that Caroline lived to age 84. She outlived Charles by 22 years. She saw all 4 of her surviving daughters grow up, marry, have children of their own. She saw Laura marry Almanzo Wilder in 1885, saw them struggle through their own farming disasters, a house fire, crop failures, Almanzo's stroke that left him partially disabled, the death of their infant son. The pattern repeated. Laura married a man like her father, a dreamer, a farmer who couldn't quite make farming work, and Laura, like her mother, held things together through sheer force of will. Maybe that's what Caroline taught her daughters, not the lessons in the books about patience and virtue, but the real lesson that women survive by being tougher than everything trying to break them. That's the story Laura eventually told, not explicitly, but embedded in every page, the subtext beneath the cozy descriptions and the folksy wisdom. Women do the work that keeps everyone alive, and no one notices, and they do it anyway, because what's the alternative? Caroline could have left Charles, in theory, divorced him, taken the girls and gone back to her mother's house in Wisconsin, but in practice that wasn't really an option. Divorced women in the 1870s were social pariahs. They had almost no legal rights to their children, no way to support themselves. Divorce meant poverty and shame and losing everything, including your kids. So Caroline stayed. She made it work. She turned a bad situation into something survivable. And maybe, just maybe, there were good times too. Moments when Charles's fiddle playing really did make everything feel okay. Moments when the girls were all healthy and laughing. Moments when the prairie was beautiful and the future felt possible. Laura wrote about those moments, preserved them, gave them to us. But she couldn't preserve Caroline's voice, her mother's actual thoughts and feelings and interior life. That's lost, forever. All we have is Laura's version. Ma who was patient, Ma who was refined, Ma who never lost her temper or her faith or her determination to maintain standards even in a dugout. Ma who was, in other words, a saint, and real women can't be saints. Real women are complicated and tired and sometimes angry and sometimes petty and sometimes just trying to get through the next 5 minutes without screaming. Real Caroline was probably all of those things, but we'll never know. And that's the tragedy of history. The voices that don't get preserved, the women who did the work but left no record, the mothers and daughters and wives whose labour kept everyone alive but whose thoughts and feelings disappeared the moment they died. Laura's books saved some of it. Some echo of Caroline, some version of who she was, but it's Laura's version. It filtered through a daughter's love and guilt and need to make her mother into something comprehensible. The real Caroline is gone. What remains is the work she did, the children she raised, the family she held together through impossible odds, and the silent question that hangs over all of it. What would Caroline have written if someone had given her a pen and paper and time and permission to tell her truth? What story would she have told? We'll never know, but maybe that's the story we need to imagine now. The untold stories, the silent voices, the women who survived but left no record. Maybe that's how we honour them, by acknowledging that the stories we have are incomplete, that Laura told her truth, but her truth wasn't everyone's truth, that Caroline's life deserves to be remembered too. even if we can only glimpse it through fragments and inference. Maybe the next story we tell shouldn't be about Laura at all. Maybe it should be about Caroline, about the woman who packed that wagon 8 times, who lived in a dugout and made it a home, who buried a baby and kept cooking dinner, who watched her husband fail over and over and just kept going, about the woman who made Laura possible. Because here's what we know for certain. Without Caroline, there is no Laura Ingalls Wilder. There are no Little House books. There is no American mythology of the frontier family. Caroline was the foundation. The one who ensured the family survived long enough for Laura to grow up, remember, and write it all down. That's Caroline's legacy, not the character in the books. The real woman who did the impossible work of keeping her family alive against all odds. She deserves her own story, and the fact that she never got to tell it herself is the real tragedy of the frontier. Not the grasshoppers, not the crop failures, not even the dead baby. The tragedy is the silence, the lost voices, the women who survived everything except history's indifference. But maybe, if we look closely enough at the gaps in Laura's story, we can hear Caroline anyway. Faintly, like an echo across 150 years. The sound of a woman packing a wagon. Again. The sound of a mother reading to her daughters by lamplight. The sound of someone doing impossible work and making it look easy. That's Caroline. And she matters just as much as Laura. Maybe more. You need to understand something about the woman who actually wrote the Little House books. Her name wasn't Laura. It's 1930. You're sitting in a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, watching a 63-year-old woman bent over a school tablet writing in pencil. Her handwriting is shaky. The spelling is inconsistent. The grammar wanders. That's Laura Ingalls Wilder, pouring out 74,000 words of raw memory. Everything she can remember from ages 2 to 18. The whole truth. The poverty, the failures, the dead baby, the illegal land claims, the racism she absorbed as a child. She writes it all down. Pioneer Girl, her autobiography. Unfiltered. And then she mails it to her daughter. Rose Wilder Lane is 44 years old in 1930. She's living in a stone house in Rocky Ridge, just up the hill from her parents' farmhouse, and she's one of the highest paid writers in America. You need to let that sink in. While Laura and Almanzo are barely scraping by on their farm, their daughter is making more money from writing than most families see in a decade. Rose has published novels, magazine articles, biographies. She's travelled to Europe, to Albania, to Baghdad. She's sophisticated, educated, worldly. She's everything Laura never got to be. And when Rose reads her mother's manuscript, she sees potential. Not a publishable book. Not yet. But the raw material for one. Here's what happens next. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Rose takes Laura's manuscript and rewrites it. Not edits it. Rewrites it. She restructures entire sections. She invents dialogue. She changes the narrative voice. She adds scenes Laura never wrote. She removes things that are too dark for children's literature. She transforms Laura's adult autobiography into children's fiction, and then she types it up on her typewriter, making it look professional, making it publishable. The question that has haunted scholars for decades is this: where does Laura end and Rose begin? Because the books that got published, the books that became the Little House series, don't sound like Laura's original manuscript. They sound like Rose's other work. The sentence structure, the pacing, the narrative sophistication. Rose had a distinctive style, clean prose, efficient storytelling, emotional manipulation that felt natural rather than forced. She knew how to write books that sold. Laura didn't. Laura had memories and raw emotion, and the ability to describe a dugout in sensory detail, but she didn't have craft. Rose gave her craft. But at what cost? Let me take you inside that stone house in 1930. Rose, reading her mother's manuscript, page after page of Laura's shaky handwriting describing poverty and failure and dead babies. Rose makes notes. Too depressing. Won't sell. Children won't understand this. She's not wrong. Publishers in the 1930s weren't interested in grim frontier realism. They wanted uplift. They wanted stories that told Depression-era readers that their grandparents had survived hard times through virtue and hard work. Laura's raw manuscript didn't say that. Laura's manuscript said her father failed repeatedly, and her mother endured and her baby brother died and nothing worked out the way it was supposed to. That wasn't marketable, so Rose changed it. She made Pa a hero instead of a dreamer who couldn't hold on to land. She made Ma a saint instead of an exhausted woman barely holding it together. She made the moves sound like adventures instead of economic catastrophes. She turned Laura's complicated, messy, painful memories into a story that could be sold. And it worked. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932. It sold steadily. Not a sensation immediately, but respectable sales. Publishers wanted more, so Laura wrote more, and Rose edited more, and the pattern continued through 8 books over 11 years. But here's where it gets messy. Rose didn't just edit. She claimed privately that she was the real author, that Laura just provided the memories and Rose did all the actual writing. Laura disagreed. Vehemently. She said the stories were hers, the words were hers, Rose just helped polish them. They fought about this for years, increasingly bitter fights as the books became more successful and the question of authorship became more important. There are letters between them, tense, cold letters, where Rose complains that her name isn't on the covers, where Laura insists she wrote the books herself. Both of them were partly right and partly lying. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Laura wrote the raw material. Rose transformed it into publishable literature. The books that exist are a collaboration, whether either of them wanted to admit it or not. But that collaboration was fraught with resentment and power dynamics, and the complicated relationship between a mother who'd sacrificed everything and a daughter who'd escaped. Because that's what Rose did. She escaped. Rose Gillette Wilder was born in 1886 in De Smet, South Dakota. Laura and Almanzo's only surviving child. They'd had a son who died as an infant. They'd lost their first house to fire. They'd failed at farming just like Charles had failed. Rose grew up watching her parents struggle, watching them work themselves to exhaustion for nothing, and she decided early that she wasn't going to live that way. She got educated, she got out, she moved to San Francisco, became a telegrapher, then a journalist, then a novelist. She married and divorced. She travelled the world. She lived in ways Laura never could have imagined. And she made money. Real money. Enough to buy property. Enough to support her parents when they got old. Rose even helped build her parents' current farmhouse in Mansfield. She paid for improvements. She sent money when times were tight. In some ways, Rose saved Laura and Almanzo, gave them security they never could have achieved on their own. But there was a cost to that salvation. Rose controlled things, made decisions, took charge in ways that probably infantilized her elderly parents. And when Laura wanted to tell her story, Rose controlled that too. Now, I'm not saying Rose was villainous. She wasn't. She genuinely loved her mother. She wanted Laura to succeed. She wanted the books to be good. But Rose had her own agenda, political even. By the 1930s, Rose was becoming increasingly libertarian. She believed in radical self-reliance, in minimal government, in the idea that individuals who worked hard could overcome anything, and she saw Laura's childhood as proof of that philosophy. Never mind that Laura's family actually survived through community support and government programs and pure luck. Never mind that they failed at farming and had to rely on wage labour. Never mind that the Homestead Act was a government program. Rose wanted the books to show self-reliant pioneers conquering the frontier through individual effort. So she edited them to say that. Scholars have compared Laura's original manuscripts to the published books. The differences are striking. Laura's version, more pessimistic, more acknowledgement of failure, more complicated emotions. Rose's version, more optimistic, more triumph over adversity, more clear moral lessons. Rose made the books into propaganda for a world view. Beautiful, effective propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. And Laura either didn't notice or didn't care enough to fight it. She was in her 60s, finally making money from writing, finally having some financial security. She wasn't going to jeopardize that by insisting on a version of her story that wouldn't sell. So she let Rose have her way. Mostly, they compromised, they argued, they revised. and eventually they produced 8 books that became American classics. But the woman on those book covers, Laura Ingalls Wilder, is a construction, a collaboration, a literary creation that's part Laura's memory, part Rose's craft, part the demands of the market. The real Laura is somewhere underneath all that, buried under layers of revision and editorial intervention and market forces, and we'll never fully excavate her. Because here's the thing about writing memoir, about turning life into literature. You can't tell the whole truth. The whole truth is boring and repetitive and full of meaningless details that don't advance any narrative. So you select, you shape, you impose meaning on things that felt meaningless when they happened. You lie, in other words, not maliciously, but necessarily. All memoir is fiction to some degree. All autobiography is reconstruction. Laura and Rose just did it more extensively than most. They turned a failed farming family into pioneer heroes. They turned economic disaster into character-building hardship. They turned a complicated, messy childhood into a narrative arc that taught lessons about perseverance. And millions of readers bought it. Literally bought it. The books sold and kept selling. By the time Laura died in 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday, she was famous. The Little House books were canonical. They were taught in schools, read by children across America. Laura died knowing she'd succeeded. She'd turned her hard life into something beautiful, something lasting. But did she ever wish she'd told the whole truth? Did she ever regret letting Rose change so much? We don't know. She never said. What we do know is that Rose outlived her mother by 11 years. Rose died in 1968, age 81. And even after Laura was gone, Rose couldn't let go of the authorship question. She told people she'd written the books. That Laura was just the source material. It was cruel, honestly, to claim credit after Laura couldn't defend herself. But maybe Rose believed it. Maybe after years of editing and revising and transforming Laura's words, Rose genuinely felt like the books were more hers than Laura's. Maybe they were. The scholar Pamela Smith Hill, who edited the annotated Pioneer Girl, has tried to untangle it all, to figure out who wrote what, to separate Laura's voice from Rose's interventions. It's almost impossible. The collaboration is too complete. The layers are too intertwined. What we're left with is uncertainty, the knowledge that the books we love were created by 2 women with very different goals, very different voices, very different relationships to the material, and that both of them lied, and both of them shaped and selected and omitted. The Little House books aren't Laura's story. They're a story Laura and Rose built together from the raw material of Laura's life, and that story leaves out more than it includes. It leaves out Rose entirely. None of the books mention that Laura had a daughter. Rose doesn't appear in the narrative at all, even though she was alive during the later book's composition. Why? Because including Rose would complicate the frontier narrative, would require explaining that Laura failed at farming just like her father had, that she only achieved success through writing, not through pioneering. That didn't fit the myth. So Rose wrote herself out of her mother's story, made herself invisible. The irony is almost painful. The woman who arguably wrote most of the books doesn't appear in them at all. But maybe that's fitting, because the Little House books were never really about truth. They were about creating a version of the past that people needed. Depression-era readers needed to believe that their ancestors had overcome hardship through virtue, that hard work always paid off, that families who stuck together could survive anything. It wasn't true, but it was necessary. And Laura and Rose, whatever their complicated relationship, whatever their fights about authorship and credit, gave people that necessary myth. They gave America a story about itself that felt true even when it wasn't. That's the power of literature, of storytelling, of taking life and shaping it into meaning. But it's also the danger, because once a story becomes myth, it becomes harder to see the truth underneath. The truth is that Laura was a complicated woman who had a complicated childhood and made complicated choices about how to remember it. The truth is that Rose was a brilliant writer with her own agenda who shaped her mother's memories to fit a political philosophy. The truth is that the books we love are beautiful, meaningful, important literature that also happen to be historically misleading. All of that is true, simultaneously. and we have to hold all of it if we want to really understand what the Little House books are and what they mean. But here's what keeps me up at night about Rose Wilder Lane. She died in 1968. The Vietnam War was raging. The civil rights movement was transforming America. The country her mother had written about, that wholesome frontier America of self-reliant families, felt like a fantasy. Did Rose know? At the end, that the myth she'd helped create was a lie? Did she care? Or did she believe, right up until she died, that the story was more important than the truth? We'll never know. Rose left no confession, no deathbed revelation. She just died, and took her secrets with her, leaving us with books we can't quite trust and a history we can't quite access, leaving us with questions that have no answers, leaving us standing in the gap between what happened and what got written down. And maybe that's where we belong, in that gap, in that uncertainty. Because certainty is what Laura and Rose were selling. The certainty that hard work pays off, that families endure, that the past was simpler and better. Uncertainty is what they were hiding. The uncertainty of whether you'll eat next winter, whether your crops will fail, whether your baby will survive, whether your father's dreams will destroy you. Laura lived with that uncertainty her entire childhood, and then she spent her 60s erasing it from the record. Rose helped her erase it, made it disappear under layers of polish and narrative arc and moral lessons, and now we're left trying to find it again, trying to excavate the real story from under the myth. It's like archaeology, brushing away layers of dirt to find what's underneath. Except in this case, the dirt is beautiful. The dirt is literature. The dirt is art. And maybe we shouldn't brush it away at all. Maybe we should just acknowledge that it's there, that the story and the truth are different things, that both have value, that Laura Ingalls Wilder created something important even if it wasn't entirely true, that Rose Wilder Lane helped create it, even if she shouldn't have claimed all the credit, that both women were complicated and flawed and did the best they could with what they had, just like Caroline packing that wagon 8 times, just like Charles chasing dreams off cliffs, just like all of us, trying to make sense of our lives by turning them into stories. The difference is, Laura's story became America's story, and that means we all live with the consequences of what she chose to include and what she chose to leave out, whether we know it or not. The gap between myth and truth is where we've been standing this entire time. You felt it in Chapter 1 when you learned Laura lied. You felt it in Chapter 2 standing at that dugout. You felt it in Chapter 3 when Freddie disappeared from history. You felt it in Chapter 4 visiting a site that exists in 3 versions simultaneously. You felt it in Chapter 5 realizing Caroline's voice was erased. You felt it in Chapter 6 discovering Rose's invisible hand. That gap, that uncomfortable space between what happened and what got written down. Most stories try to close that gap, try to give you certainty, try to tell you, this is what really happened, and here's what it means. But the story of the real towns behind Little House on the Prairie refuses to close. Because here's the truth we've been circling for 7 chapters. There is no single truth. There are only versions, layers, competing narratives built from the same raw materials. There's the version Charles told himself, the dreamer who saw every move as opportunity, every failure as temporary setback, who died in 1902 at age 66 in De Smet, probably still believing that next year would have been better. There's the version Caroline lived but never spoke, the woman who packed 8 wagons and buried 1 baby and watched her eldest daughter go blind and somehow kept breathing, who outlived her husband by 22 years and died at 84, having seen everything she survived become a children's book. There's the version Laura remembered at age 7, watching grasshoppers eat the sky. The version she remembered at 63, writing in pencil on school tablets. 2 different versions from the same person at different ages. There's the version Rose created, the polished, marketable, politically useful version that told Depression-era America that pioneers conquered hardship through individual virtue. There's the version the TV show broadcast into millions of homes, Michael Landon's perfect hair and Karen Grassel's patient smile, and a prairie that looked like a painting instead of a killing ground. And there's the version you brought with you tonight, the childhood memory of reading these books or watching this show and feeling something. Connection, comfort, a sense that families could survive anything. All of these versions are real, all of them shaped by the needs and limitations and agendas of the people who created them. So when you visit Walnut Grove today, when you stand at that depression in the ground where the dugout was, which version are you visiting? All of them. Simultaneously, you're visiting the actual place where Caroline Ingalls cooked meals on a stove in a dirt room, where Laura played along Plum Creek, where Charles filed land papers he couldn't afford to honour, where grasshoppers descended like a plague and ate everything including hope. But you're also visiting the place where Pa played fiddle and Ma made everything okay, and Laura learned lessons about kindness. The place from the books, the place that never quite existed but feels more real than reality. And you're visiting the place where a TV crew never filmed but everyone imagines they did. The Golden Prairie, the perfect family, the America we wish we'd been. You can't separate these versions, they're braided together like the strands of a rope, and pulling one strand unravels the whole thing. So maybe the question isn't, what's the real story? Maybe the question is, why do we need these stories at all? Why did Laura need to transform her childhood into myth? Why did Rose need to make that myth marketable? Why did Depression-era readers need to believe pioneers succeeded through virtue? Why did 1970s TV audiences need to see the frontier as a place where good people won? Why do visitors today pay admission to stand in a dent in the ground and feel connected to something? Because stories do what facts can't. They give meaning to suffering. They impose narrative structure on chaos. They tell us that the hard parts matter, that struggle builds character, that survival means something. Laura's childhood was poverty and displacement and failure. Those are facts, but Laura's books are about resilience and family and making do. Those are meanings. The facts don't disappear when you add meaning, but the meaning makes the facts bearable, makes them into something you can hold on to when your own life gets hard. That's what Laura gave us, not truth, but meaning. And maybe that's more valuable. Or maybe it's dangerous. Maybe turning frontier poverty into wholesome pioneer values lets us ignore the systemic failures that created that poverty in the first place. Maybe celebrating Charles's persistence lets us avoid asking why the Homestead Act set families up to fail. Why 160 acres wasn't enough. Why the government opened indigenous land to white settlement without adequate support for the settlers who came. Maybe romanticising Caroline's endurance lets us ignore how few choices women had, how marriage was often economic survival rather than partnership, how women's work was invisible and unpaid and endless. Maybe making Mary's blindness into a lesson about overcoming obstacles lets us avoid asking why a 14-year-old girl had no access to medical care that might have saved her sight. Maybe transforming Freddie's death into an absence in the narrative lets us avoid confronting infant mortality rates that killed 1 in 4 children before age 5. The stories Laura told are beautiful, but they're also erasures. They erase the indigenous people whose land the Ingalls family settled on, the Osage in Kansas, the Dakota in Minnesota. Their forced removal made white settlement possible, but Laura's books treat the land as empty, available, waiting to be claimed. They erase the economic structures that made frontier farming so precarious. The debt, the land speculation, the railroad companies that controlled prices and access to markets. The entire system that was designed to benefit capital rather than families. They erase women's resistance. Caroline probably fought against those moves, probably argued, probably said no. But in Laura's books, Ma is serene and supportive. The anger is scrubbed out. The resentment is erased. They erase failure. The books end in Desmet with the family finally settled and successful. But that success came from town jobs, and later from Laura's writing, not from farming. Charles never succeeded at farming. Ever. But admitting that would undermine the entire mythology of the yeoman farmer building America. So it got erased. And now, 150 years later, we're standing in the gap between the erasures and the reality, trying to figure out what to do with stories we love that are built on foundations we can't defend. Do we throw them out? Declare them problematic and move on? That seems like waste. The books are genuinely beautiful literature. They've brought comfort to millions. They've taught literacy to generations of children. They've preserved sensory details about frontier life that would otherwise be lost. Do we accept them uncritically? Teach them as history? Let the mythology stand? That seems irresponsible. Because the mythology shapes how we understand westward expansion, how we think about individual versus systemic responsibility, how we remember who built this country and at what cost. So maybe we do what we've been doing tonight. We hold both. We acknowledge that the books are beautiful fiction that helped people survive the Depression and are still bringing comfort today. And we acknowledge that they're historically misleading in ways that erase Indigenous dispossession and systemic economic failure and women's unpaid labour. Both things are true, simultaneously, and standing in that gap, holding both truths, is uncomfortable. It requires nuance, it requires giving up certainty. But maybe that's what responsible engagement with the past requires. Not choosing between myth and fact, but understanding how they relate, how they've shaped each other, how the stories we tell about the past shape the present we inhabit. Because here's what happens when you visit Walnut Grove today. You see a small town in Minnesota that's kept itself alive through literary tourism, through pageants and museums and gift shops selling sunbonnets. The town's economy depends on the mythology. If visitors learned the whole truth, that the Ingalls family failed here, fled poverty, left a dead baby behind, would they still come? Maybe not. Maybe they need the myth to make the trip worthwhile. But the people who live there, who maintain the museum and perform in the pageant and give tours of the Dugout site, they know the truth. They've read the land records. They've seen the census data. They know the difference between the books and the history. And they choose to preserve both. They present the historical facts in exhibit cases while performing scenes from the books on stage. They let visitors hold the contradiction. That seems right to me. That seems like the only ethical way to handle beloved myths that are built on uncomfortable truths. You don't destroy the myth, but you don't let it stand alone either. You contextualize it. You complicate it. You give people the tools to understand what they're actually looking at. And then you let them decide what it means to them. Because meaning is personal. What I take from Laura's story might be completely different from what you take. We're bringing different lives, different needs, different questions. I see a woman who survived childhood trauma and turned it into art, who made conscious choices about what to include and exclude, who collaborated with her complicated daughter to create something that outlived both of them. You might see pioneer values, or you might see systemic failure, or you might see a beloved childhood memory that you're not ready to complicate yet. All of those readings are valid, none of them are complete. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder's story is too big for any single interpretation. Too complicated, too layered. It's a story about poverty and literature, about memory and manipulation, about mothers and daughters, about the American frontier and the American dream, about truth and lies and the infinite space between them. It's a story that refuses to be simple, and that's why it matters. Because simple stories are easy to consume and easy to forget. Complicated stories stick with you, make you think, make you question. This story has made you question tonight. Question what you thought you knew. Question whose voices got preserved and whose got erased. Question the difference between history and memory. That discomfort you're feeling, that's growth. That's what happens when you learn something that complicates your worldview. And here's what I want you to take with you when this ends. The next time you encounter a beloved story from your childhood, ask questions. Whose perspective is this? What's being left out? Who benefits from this version? What would the people not in the story say if they could speak? The next time you visit a historical site, look for the gaps, the plaques that don't quite add up, the tours that skip uncomfortable parts, the gift shops selling nostalgia for things that never existed. The next time someone tells you about the good old days, ask them, good for whom? Because the frontier might have been opportunity for some people, but it was dispossession for others. It was crushing poverty for many. It was death for too many children. History is never simple. It's never clean. It's always contested. Always being revised as new evidence emerges and new questions get asked. The Laura Ingalls Wilder we're understanding today is different from the Laura of 1974 when the TV show premiered. She's different from the Laura of 1937 when the first book published. And the Laura future historians understand will be different from ours, because we keep learning, we keep digging, we keep finding the voices that were erased and the facts that were omitted and the complicated truths that simple stories can't hold. That's what makes history alive. Not frozen in amber, not settled, but constantly being re-examined. And the real towns behind Little House on the Prairie are perfect examples of that living history. They exist in physical space. You can visit them. Walk the ground Laura walked. See the creek she played in. Stand where the dugout was. But they also exist in literary space, in the books that millions have read, in the TV show that millions have watched, in the myths we've built about pioneers and Prairie and the American frontier. And they exist in the gap between those two spaces, between fact and fiction, between what happened and what we say happened. That gap is where truth lives. Complicated, uncomfortable, irreducible truth. And you're standing in it right now. So what do you do with it? With this knowledge that the stories you loved aren't quite true, you could be angry, feel betrayed, decide that Laura lied and therefore the books are worthless. Or you could be understanding, recognize that all autobiography is selective, that Laura did what she had to do to survive and to give her readers something they needed. Or you could be curious, want to know more, start reading the research, visit the sites, dig into the complexity, or you could be all of those things at once, because feelings about complicated stories are themselves complicated. Whatever you feel, whatever you decide to do with this information, you now know something you didn't know before. You know that the Little House on the Prairie was actually a dugout in a creek bank, that Pa wasn't heroic, he was impulsive, that Ma's silence was probably resentment, that Laura rewrote history with Rose's help, that the books you loved are beautiful lies, and you know that those lies mattered, that they gave people hope during the Depression, that they taught children to read, that they created a mythology that shaped American identity. All of that is true, the lies, and their value, the erasures and their consequences, and now you get to decide what to do with that knowledge. Me? I'm going to keep telling this story, keep asking people to stand in the gap with me, keep insisting that we can love the books and critique them, that we can honour Laura's artistry while acknowledging what she omitted. Because that's what responsible engagement with the past looks like. Not choosing sides, but holding contradictions, not seeking simple answers, but sitting with complex questions. The real towns behind Little House on the Prairie teach us that. They teach us that places hold multiple stories, that history is layered, that truth is complicated, and they teach us that the gap between myth and reality isn't something to be feared or avoided. It's where we learn, where we grow, where we become capable of seeing the past clearly enough to build a better future. So thank you for standing in the gap with me tonight, for the uncomfortable journey from beloved childhood story to complicated historical truth. The next time you see a sunbonnet or hear a fiddle tune, you'll remember. You'll remember Caroline's exhaustion, Charles's failures, Freddie's erased grave, Rose's invisible hand, the grasshoppers, the dugout, the $13 loss on 2 years of work. You'll remember that the story was never simple, and maybe, just maybe, that will make you look at all the other simple stories in your life a little more carefully. Ask what's being left out, who's being erased, what complications are being smoothed away to make the narrative work. Because every story does this. Every history, every memoir, every family legend passed down through generations. We simplify to make sense of chaos. We omit to make stories bearable. We reshape to give meaning to suffering. It's human. It's what we do. But we can also learn to see through it, to find the gaps, to honour the erased voices, to stand in the uncomfortable space between what happened and what got written down. That's the gift the real towns gave us tonight. The gift of complexity. The gift of questions without easy answers. The gift of seeing Laura Ingalls Wilder clearly, not as a saint or a liar, but as a woman who did what she had to do, who created something beautiful from something painful, who left us a legacy that's both valuable and problematic, just like the frontier itself, just like America itself, beautiful and terrible, opportunity and dispossession, success and failure, all of it true, all of it complicated, all of it worth understanding. So the next time someone tells you about pioneers conquering the West, you'll know better. You'll know about the dugout in the creek bank, the crops that failed, the baby in the unmarked grave, the woman who rewrote history, the daughter who rewrote her mother. You'll know that the real story is always more complicated than the myth. And that's okay, because complicated stories are the only ones worth telling. And this one, this story of Laura and Caroline and Rose and Charles and the real towns in Minnesota where everything fell apart, this story will stay with you. Long after you close this tab or turn off this video, you'll carry it with you. This knowledge, this discomfort, this new way of seeing. And maybe, just maybe, it'll change how you see everything else too. That's what good stories do. They change you, even when they're about lies, especially when they're about lies. Welcome to the Gap. It's uncomfortable here, but at least it's true. And if you want to know what happened next, if you want to follow Laura and Almanzo to Spring Valley, Minnesota, where Laura spent years with his family before the move to De Smet, that's another story, another town, another set of truths that got erased from the books, another gap to explore. But that's for next time. For now, drop your city and time in the comments. Tell me what story you thought you knew that turned out to be more complicated. Because we're all standing in gaps between who we thought we were and who we're becoming. Between the stories we were told and the truths we're discovering, Laura's gap became American mythology. What will yours become?